How to make hummingbird food or hummingbird nectar? What are the right things to use in there? And what are the right ratios to mix it in? Let's start with some of the things that we should avoid using. Things like honey, although good for us and maybe even organic, are not good for hummingbirds because they create an environment in the feeders that are even more conducive to growing molds and bacteria, which, as we know, can be very harmful for our little friends. We want to avoid using the raw, organic, colored type of sugars, which also includes confectioner's sugars, which will contain cornstarch. We don't want to be feeding our hummingbird friends cornstarch, do we? The absolute best thing that you can use to feed your hummingbirds is pure white processed sugar. There are two types of sugar that will work equally well, and it's basically going to depend on where you live geographically to the availability of these. If you're living in the US, your most commonly used processed white sugar for this will likely be cane sugar. Now, conversely, if you live in certain parts of Canada, that's a little bit difficult to find, and the main source of granulated white sugar that you're going to find is beet sugar. The good news is, and I want to share with you, that either cane sugar or beet sugar is equally good and safe to use while feeding your hummingbirds, isn't it? Let's talk about the right ratio to make hummingbird nectar or hummingbird food that will bring them in like crazy to your feeders. The standard, pretty much universal ratio is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. So let's say 1/4 cup sugar to 1 cup of water. If you're watching this from the US or Canada, for the most part, that's all you ever need to know and will handle all of your hummingbird feeding needs. Well, are there exceptions to this 4-to-1 ratio for hummingbird food? And if so, what are they? One exception I would consider is if you're experiencing considerable cold weather that's unseasonable. Let's say, for example, you live in a spot that can get snowstorms well into hummingbird season. In scenarios like this where it drops below freezing or you get snow for a period of time, I would consider increasing the strength of your hummingbird food from 4-to-1 to 3-to-1, which is 1 part sugar to 3 parts water. This will give the hummingbirds the additional energy they might require because the flowers that they're usually feeding on might be damaged under these scenarios. Another scenario that's similar to this that I've witnessed personally is there's a geographical region on Vancouver Island, Canada, near and around the city of Victoria, where the Anna's hummingbirds want to stay there all year round, all through the winter now. Sometimes during the winter in this region, it can become snowy and below zero for periods of time. This is another scenario where I would increase the strength of my hummingbird food to 3-to-1 now instead of 4-to-1. Right? A third scenario where I would consider increasing the strength of my hummingbird nectar would be in the case of migration. The average hummingbird, like these little buddies right here, will fly 20 to 25 miles a day during migration, which is what we're in right now. Now, in particular cases, like in the case of coastal Texas, the ruby-throated hummingbirds will gather there to fuel up for their flight across the Gulf of Mexico, where they can be flying continuously non-stop for upwards of 500 miles in a day. Both of those scenarios there, I would definitely increase the strength of my hummingbird food to give them that additional energy that they're going to require for these journeys. On the flip side of that, are there ever scenarios present where we should consider diluting or making weaker hummingbird food? In the case of unseasonably hot weather, you might consider diluting your hummingbird nectar to about 5-to-1 now, which is 1 part sugar to 5 parts water. This will give the hummingbirds the increased water that they're going to need in the increased heat and long sunshine hours. Another side bonus to going to 5-to-1 mix in extremely hot weather is now your hummingbird feeders will become less attractive to bees and wasps and other unsavory insects because the sugar concentration is just not as strong. Additionally, because the hummingbirds aren't getting as much sugar as they normally would be, you'll be seeing them visiting you more frequently. This is a bit of a specialty situation where you would consider diluting your hummingbird nectar, and that is the case where we recently spent 6 months in Ecuador, maybe the hummingbird capital of the world. It's practically hummingbird heaven. Anyway, on 3 separate occasions, I had unsolicited information from ornithologists who approached me and said, you know, the right mix for this region is 7-to-1. So 1 part sugar to 7 parts water, quite diluted. After hearing that, I of course adopted this ratio. The hummingbirds there seemed to love it. And in our time in Ecuador, we saw over 60 different species of hummingbirds. You can see many of those videos on our channel. Now that you know how to make hummingbird food, the next thing you're going to want to learn how to do is clean those hummingbird feeders to keep your little friends safe and happy while they're feeding at your yard.
Yeah, thanks for the clean hummingbird feeders. Sugar Daddy, you're the man.
You're welcome, little buddy.